Hey there, Joshua Johnson speaking. It's great to be with you on this Tuesday, June 28th. And tonight, we're talking about that gripping January 6th hearing.
I'm the effing president. Take me up to the Capitol now.
Today's witness laid out former President Trump's actions as the Capitol was under attack. We'll break down the big revelations and consider where all this is leading. Some Republican candidates in today's primaries have supported the hoax that fueled the attack. Polls just closed in Illinois and Oklahoma. Steve Kornacki has the latest at the big board. Also tonight, two stories about women's health. First, the Biden administration lays out its action plan to safeguard abortion access. And later, why does a woman's period cause so much exclamation? More women are trying to take the stigma out of menstruation. We'll show you how in tonight's feature report. So today's January 6th hearing gave us a ton to talk about. But it's another primary election Tuesday, and if you live in any of these states, you've also got some big races to watch. Not just primaries, but a runoff election and a special election as well. Both these sets of stories are connected. Steve Kornacki's here to walk us through it in just a minute, but let's begin with the hearing. Today we heard testimony from a young woman with a unique view of January 6th. The view from inside the White House. 25-year-old Cassidy Hutchinson was a longtime aide to Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. She testified to what was going on behind the scenes when that mob attacked the U.S. Capitol. Ms. Hutchinson said the former president knew his supporters could get violent that day. He was also apparently told that some of them had weapons, but apparently that did not faze him since, as she put it, he felt they were not there to hurt him. That did not change after some weapons got intercepted by magnetometers, or mags. It was captured in a pre-recorded video, and Ms. Hutchinson confirmed it.
I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, you know, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
Cassidy Hutchinson also claims that President Trump got into a bit of a physical altercation with a Secret Service agent named Bobby Engel. She testified that the president tried to commandeer his vehicle in the motorcade and get to the Capitol.
So once the president had gotten into the vehicle with Bobby, he thought that they were going up to the Capitol, and when Bobby had relayed to him, we don't have the assets to do it. It's not secure. We're going back to the West Wing. The president had a very angry response to that. Tony described him as being irate. The president said something to the effect of, I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now. To which Bobby responded, sir, we have to go back to the West Wing. The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol. Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. And when Mr. Renato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
Now, sources close to the Secret Service tell NBC News that both Mr. Engel and the driver of that presidential limousine are prepared to testify under oath that neither man was assaulted and that Mr. Trump never lunged at anyone or anything. Plenty for us to get into now with John Bresnahan, co-founder of Punchbowl News, and Jill Wine-Banks, an MSNBC legal analyst and former assistant Watergate special prosecutor. Good to see you both. And John, let me start with you. What do you think is the net effect of what we heard today in terms of the overall goals of the January 6th committee?
I think they were very pleased with what the way it came across, what Hutchinson, where Cassidy Hutchinson came across as a witness. I do think you'll see the pushback. There will be Trump and his allies will attack parts of her story. That's how they'll try to unravel the whole thing. This incident in the car. We know Trump has already said he was angry and he yelled at Secret Service agent in a car, whether or not he lunged for the wheel or, I'm not sure that's really germane. What we do know is this. Here was a president who was furious about his loss, re-election campaign in November 2020. He couldn't handle it. And he kept, pushing chips in the table. He kept upping the pressure and upping the pressure and upping the pressure. The way Cassidy Hutchinson told it, he was throwing a plate at the wall after Bill Barr said, I didn't find any, widespread election fraud. He was, when he was told that there were a chance of hang Mike Pence, he didn't care. He was telling people he was okay with that. This was a angry, I don't want to say out of control, but borderline out of control president. And he was willing to do what it took to overturn the results of the election. And I think it's just shocking. It's kind of stunning to hear it all, the narrative laid out like that.
Yeah, John, since you mentioned that, here is the part of the hearing where Cassidy Hutchinson talked about some of the behind-the-scenes conversation in response to the mob calling for Mike Pence's head. Watch.
I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. To which Pat said something, this is effing crazy. We need to be doing something more.
Jill, what about the fallout from here and where this goes from here? Let me play one more clip describing a conversation she had with White House attorney Pat Cipollone on the morning of the 6th and his concerns about what the aftermath of it all might be. Watch.
I saw Mr. Cipollone right before I walked out onto West Exec that morning, and Mr. Cipollone said something to the effect of, please make sure we don't go up to the Capitol, Cassidy. Keep in touch with me. We're going to get charged with every crime imaginable if we make that movement happen.
And do you remember which crimes Mr. Cipollone was concerned with?
In the days leading up to the 6th, we had conversations about potentially obstructing justice or defrauding the electoral count.
There was also talk about the members of Congress and lawmakers who asked for pardons kind of early in this process. She laid out quite a few of them. Jill, how does this affect your view in terms of actual criminal actions that may come from all of this? I think that still remains somewhat questionable in some ways and perhaps a little bit clearer in others.
I'd say a little bit more than a little bit clearer. I think that she provided enough testimony about his knowledge, his intent, and his actions to bring at least to full investigation for things like obstruction of Congress, which is, of course, a federal crime and which he clearly was intending, the inciting of an insurrection, which is a crime that would bar him from ever holding office again. So it's an important one. And she clearly made that plain. The obstruction of Congress might or might not bar him from holding office, but it is a criminal case. Defrauding the U.S. is another crime that she laid out. So I think all of these things, and it also shows that his aides knew that they were doing things that were criminal, because why else would they be asking for pardons? It's because they knew that what they were doing was criminal. And I see this both as a prosecutor being a very viable case, and I see it as a voter and a citizen as something that would affect my vote in considering who I would support and what I would demand of people who I was voting for. And Fox News did carry this hearing today, so I'm hoping that some of the people watching that are rethinking their support for Donald Trump, not only because of throwing a plate at the wall and having, that kind of an outbreak, which you wouldn't want someone who has the nuclear codes to act in that manner, but also whether he grabbed the steering wheel, which her testimony seemed very credible to me, very believable, and very consistent. And it's always in his mind projection. It's someone else's fault. He now doesn't even know who she is, which is, of course, irrelevant. Doesn't matter if he knows her. She heard, she testified. That's what's important. And I think the urgency for her testifying today may be that she's one of the witnesses who was threatened. And they wanted to get her on record to minimize that threat, because once it's out in public, the threat diminishes.
We're going to talk in a minute with Steve about some of the primaries that are going on today. But John, what's your sense of the impact of these hearings beyond Washington, if any? I mean, the committee said, they kind of made it sound like we absolutely have to hear from this young woman today because it's just too important. It can't wait. It builds on everything else we're doing. I know there's been a lot of speculation in terms of whether these hearings are moving the needle, so to speak, whether the American people are actually paying attention, whether this is going to have any impact. How do you see it?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, this is the 6th of these hearings. They've been very dramatic. They've uncovered a lot of new information. The view they have presented of not only Trump, but the Republican leadership in Congress, especially on the House side, is pretty poor. And a lot of these folks are running for re-election this year. And, Kevin McCarthy, who played a role in today's hearings, wants to be Speaker of the House. It's hard to say. I don't think you could take this in isolation. You take this, with the Roe ruling. But, on the other side of that, you have really a whole series of really bad economic news that's driving, President Joe Biden's ratings, down into the, low 40s and 30s. I think this is damaging. Is it enough to swing election? Probably not. But I think you have to put this into context. The day of the attack, 140 Republicans voted against certifying Joe Biden's electoral victory. I mean, they knew that what was going on was wrong, and yet they still decided with Trump on it. And I do think that is, if you want a red line on what your party stands for, the Democrats on one side and the Republicans on the other, you can't have a more clear red line. And I think voters will have a very, very clear choice this November. We'll see which side brings out more of their own folks.
And Jill, one more real quick thing before I have to go. A lot of the narrative from today's hearing had to do with the people around the president who tried to rein him in, including the Secret Service agent who Ms. Hutchinson said got lunged at by the president, or even the people who said there is no safe way to get you to the Capitol and back. There was talk about the invocation of the 25th Amendment, which, for those who don't know, it contains a clause that allows for the presidency to be taken from the president if needed and vested in an acting president until such time as he is available, or someday she available, to perform their duties. The idea that it could have gotten that close, something that's really not easy to do, is significant. And it feels like that was a huge part of the perhaps growing narrative that there were many people who tried to tell the president this is not okay, and perhaps by just the skin of their teeth, they were able to prevail that day. But Jill, how do you see it, briefly, before we go?
I see it the same way. We came very close to losing our democracy. There were many people who were telling the president, there's no fraud, you lost this election, you lost it fair and square. It is illegal to do the things you are suggesting in terms of state legislatures doing a fake slate of electors, or having the vice president use his role, which is a ceremonial role, in counting the electoral college votes to reject them. Those things are not legal. You cannot do it. And yet he kept insisting. He knew the crowd was armed, and yet he said, go to the Capitol. I'll go with you. And he intended to do that. What he intended to do there is unclear, but all of this does put together, not any one of them is a smoking gun in themselves, but when you combine all of these things with all the other testimony we've heard from the Department of Justice, from Rusty Bowers, all Republicans, all loyal to the president, all people who wanted him to win, but didn't want to cheat to do it. I think it becomes a very compelling case. And I think the Department of Justice is going to have to take action based on it, because it's too obvious to people watching television. If it's obvious to us, then it has to be obvious to Merrick Garland.
John Bresnahan, Jill Wine-Banks, always good to see you. Thank you for helping us make sense of this hearing today. We really appreciate it. Thank you. It is, as we said, another primary election day, including more candidates who the former president endorsed. Some of them have amplified his hoax about the 2020 election. But how will that affect their chances? A recent Washington Post analysis found that so far, more than 100 Republican primary winners backed these false claims. Tonight, more GOP candidates could add to that tally, but a number of them are running in blue states. Some are hoping to unseat a Democratic governor. Congresswoman Mary Miller is running for re-election in Southeast Illinois. She has teased her GOP opponent for certifying President Biden's election win. Here in New York, the Republican candidates for governor include Andrew Giuliani. He is the son of former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. The candidate has said that he believes Donald Trump won the 2020 election. Some polls put Andrew Giuliani ahead of Congressman Lee Zeldin. New York's state Republican Party is officially backing the congressman. This state has not had an elected GOP governor since George Pataki left office back in 2006. 8 states headed to the polls today, so let's get into some of the high-profile races with NBC national political correspondent Steve Kornacki at the aforementioned big board. Steve, where do we start?
Well, we start where the votes are starting to come in, and that is in Illinois. You got a governor's race here now. On the Democratic side, J.B. Pritzker is the incumbent. Just 1% of the vote in. This is one county, Will County. It is a big one. It's one of those collar counties right outside Chicago. No surprise here, Pritzker overwhelmingly winning on the Democratic side. He's expected to romp to renomination. What's interesting about this race is what Pritzker chose to do in the last few months with the money at his disposal. He tried to take out, his goal was to take out on the Republican side, in the Republican primary, the man he believed would be his most formidable competitor in the general election. And let me show you how that's playing out here. So this is Richard Irvin. He's the mayor of Aurora. Again, that's in the Chicago area. It's actually the second biggest city in the state. And you can see Irvin is running in distant second right now. This is Darren Bailey, a state senator from downstate Illinois. He is running with Donald Trump's endorsement, and J.B. Pritzker and the Democrats also poured millions of dollars in the last few months into efforts basically to take down Irvin and to prop up Bailey. Bailey, much more conservative, much more Trump-aligned, certainly on those election issues you were just talking about, the 2020 election. Bailey, a much more a purely Trumpish candidate, and you can see this is the greater Chicago area. It's only one county right now, but there's Bailey. The votes we're getting in from that one county in the Chicago area, he's beaten Irvin 2-1. Remember, this is Irvin's territory up here. Bailey's a downstate guy. So the polls had been suggesting coming into this primary that Irvin was in trouble, that Bailey was surging. Bailey got the endorsement from Trump over the weekend right before this election. If this is indicative of what we're seeing in Will County, of what we're going to see throughout the rest of the Chicagoland area, throughout the rest of the state, that is an incredibly encouraging early sign for Bailey, an incredibly discouraging one for Irvin in this gubernatorial race. We're also keeping an eye in Illinois on a couple of congressional races here. We'll start with this one. This is the 6th district. Again, this is Chicago area. This is a Democratic incumbent, Sean Casten, because of redistricting, drawn into a district with a Democratic incumbent, Marie Newman. One of these incumbent members of Congress is going to lose, is going to be a former member of Congress by the result of tonight's election. There's also a similar race on the Republican side in the new 15th district. Mary Miller, she's endorsed by Trump. She's a freshman congresswoman. She has echoed Donald Trump's claims that the 2020 election was stolen. She's running against, under this new map, a Republican congressman. This is Rodney Davis. He's been in the House longer. This is the new 15th district here. You can see it's kind of a sprawling district that goes the length of the state here. No vote results yet here, but we're keeping an eye on that. And we also have votes. We have now called, by the way, I'm told our decision desk has officially called Pritzker the winner in that Democratic gubernatorial primary. No surprise there. One other race just to keep you apprised of here. In Oklahoma, there is a special election to fill the seat of Jim Inhofe. Senator Jim Inhofe is going to be retiring at the end of this year, ahead of the end of his term. So this is the primary to replace Inhofe on the Republican side. There is a runoff rule in Oklahoma. If nobody gets 50%, they'll have a runoff in August. This is Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen. The polls had showed him well ahead. The early vote we're getting out of Oklahoma shows him well ahead. The question is, likely to become who comes in second here. Does Mullen stay under 50%? And then who comes in second? Does that force a runoff? T.W. Shannon's the former House Speaker in Oklahoma, currently running in second. But that's the drama here. Does Mullen get up to 50%? If not, who comes in second? Who gets into that runoff? Deeply red Oklahoma, whoever emerges ultimately on the Republican side, be a huge favorite to win the seat in the fall.
Since you mentioned Oklahoma Senate, we should also note that NBC is projecting that James Lankford will prevail in that primary. Perhaps no surprise, he is the incumbent. Also projecting that Kevin Stitt, the incumbent governor of Oklahoma, will prevail in his primary. So we'll keep an eye on that race as well. I don't want to say too much about New York because the polls haven't quite closed yet. The polls don't close until 9. But we did mention Andrew Giuliani in the race. Rudy Giuliani made some headlines a few days ago for claiming that somebody hit him while he was out and about on the campaign trail. The mayor has pushed back on that. There are a number of Democrats who are testing their chances against Kathy Hochul, who was the lieutenant governor under Andrew Cuomo, became governor and is, pushing for a full term. What are some of the factors that we're looking at in the race here in New York?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting when the polls close. One question in New York has been how long will it take them to get all the votes counted? They don't have a great track record lately when it comes to that. Let's see if that's a little bit different this year. But take a look at those two races. As you mentioned, Kathy Hochul, who took over when Andrew Cuomo resigned. She does have two challengers in the Democratic primary. One here, Tom Suozzi's actually giving up a congressional seat for this campaign. He stands to lose a lot here. The polling has put Hochul well ahead on the Democratic side. So, frankly, it would be a big surprise when the votes start coming in tonight if this is even a close race. The polls have indicated Hochul has a very significant lead on the Democratic side. The Republican side, a much more complicated situation. Certainly, the polling has been telling us. As you mentioned, Lee Zeldin, he's a congressman from Long Island, long thought to have statewide political ambitions in New York, endorsed by the state party, but the late polling has suggested movement toward Andrew Giuliani. So there's been an interesting dynamic in this race. As you mentioned, Giuliani has signed on to everything his father pretty much has signed on to when it comes to talking about Trump, the 2020 election. Lee Zeldin has tried to cut less of more of a moderate path when it comes to that, although he's made some moves here, I think, towards the pro-Trump right here in anticipation of this kind of a challenge from Giuliani. So it's one of these where at the outset of this race, Zeldin was seen as the favorite. It's seen that Giuliani potentially has some late endorsement in some late momentum in this race. There are a couple of other candidates here. Rob Astorino, he ran previously. Harry Wilson, you don't see him on the board yet. There are a couple other Republican candidates. But I think the expectation is Zeldin, Giuliani, and it could be a close race between the two of them tonight. Obviously, whoever emerges, you say just the blue tilt of New York will be a prohibitive underdog in November.
And it's just a matter of kind of what kind of blue, what shade of blue New Yorkers feel like for the governor right now. Thank you, Steve. NBC National Political Correspondent Steve Kornakian. Hey, you can play with all the same data that Steve is using on NBCnews.com. Just click politics, scroll down, all this real-time data, it's all on the website. You can be your own Kornacki at home. Not that there's replacing ours, but all the data is online, especially our projections on races coming in later tonight. You'll find it all on our site. Still to come, taking action on abortion. Some healthcare clinics are scrambling to adapt after the Supreme Court's ruling. We'll get into the Biden administration's new plan of action.
This is a critical moment in our history. How we respond will speak to how we view the rights, the dignity, and the well-being of women everywhere. This is a moment of crisis in healthcare. At HHS, we will leave no stone unturned. All options are on the table. We will do everything within our legal limit of the law to reach patients and support providers. I know we're all tired. Our hearts are heavy and broken by this loss of rights and dignity. But now is the time for us to continue moving forward for the many across the country who live now in banned abortion states, who lack voice and the representation they need.
How will the Biden administration protect abortion access? Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra laid out its plans today. The key may be that phrase, within our legal limit of the law. The administration is taking steps at the federal level to try and clear up the confusion that's playing out in the states. In South Carolina, a fetal heartbeat law is now in effect. It outlaws most abortions once a fetal heartbeat is detected. That's around 6 weeks gestation. But new legislation could turn that restriction into an outright ban. A new bill would outlaw abortions in South Carolina outright and set civil penalties, and it would ban taking minors out of state for abortion services. On top of new laws being proposed, some of the existing ones are tied up in court. Courts in Louisiana and Utah have temporarily blocked those states' trigger laws. In Texas, abortions up to 6 weeks can resume temporarily. So much fallout from a Supreme Court ruling that seems highly unpopular. Take a look at this new poll out today from Monmouth University. 6 in 10 Americans say they disapprove of the ruling, and most of that group said they strongly disapprove. Joining us now is NBC News medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel. She served as a policy director in the Obama administration. Dr. Patel, welcome. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Joshua. Thanks for having me.
Let's get into the administration's plan and show some of the bullet points that are within the plan as they stated it, including increasing access to medication, abortion, making sure that the clinical judgment of doctors and hospitals gets supported in the way they treat patients, and also taking legal steps to protect family planning care. That would include emergency contraceptives and long-acting reversible contraceptives. Dr. Patel, what do you make of the administration's plan?
Well, I'll be honest, Joshua, it was underwhelming. I think that's the key word. And it's because it's really just an emphasis of things that currently exist. I mean, yes, I do hope that we continue to enforce and protect health professionals such as myself who are trying to save lives. However, that's actually technically still the law in many places, that I can deliver emergency care. It's what you actually led into with the introduction, with all the confusion, one state doing this, Arkansas, Missouri. Those are the complicated differences. And I didn't see anything today that said, we are going to work to make sure that this isn't a patchwork of access, and that in places where we know that there's going to be an issue, we are going to double, triple our efforts. And I think one of the limitations to that, Joshua, is the Hyde Amendment. There's a limit on what federal funds can do. And that's a real impediment to having an action plan from the Biden administration.
Can you break down a little bit more the nature of this confusion? I think it would be easy to look at a state where, for example, abortions have been banned outright and say, well, there's no confusion. You can't perform abortions there. Whatever those services are, there's just nothing you can do there. Where does the confusion come in? It sounds like this deals with a variety of the complex decisions that can affect women case by case, even in a state where the ban is absolute.
Yeah, that's right, Joshua. Look, if you have a clear 6 week, 8 week, 16 weeks, that might seem black and white. Joshua, how many people do you know that knew exactly how many weeks pregnant they were when they were presenting for any of the medical care they needed? And so you can see quickly how it becomes gray from black and white. But let me give you another example. Texas, this is a state where there has largely been many of these restrictions in place for weeks, and doctors have not been doing abortions. What happens when a woman who comes in 18 weeks and has a fetal heartbeat, but is having complication and is just never going to be able to go to a viable birth, and then still cannot find care because she's not dying right then and there, Joshua? They actually technically have to wait until she is literally about to die in order to offer services. Those are the kinds of clinical scenarios that are happening now. That's not hypothetical. And I think that's where the confusion is. This is where we need just an understanding of what is happening, what you can do, where you can go, and where you can't.
What do you make of some of the other ideas that have been floated by some Democratic lawmakers? I mean, a number of senators have suggested that the president make abortion clinics or reproductive health services available on federal lands in states that have strict restrictions or bans. The Biden administration has kind of downplayed that idea. I'm not sure exactly where the health policy energy should be spent in terms of people who want abortion access to be preserved, whether it's a matter of using federal lands or fighting in court or going state by state. I don't know where this goes from here, but where do you think it goes?
Yeah, I actually think you need to pursue all strategies. I think the federal land, for example, Veterans Administration clinics. I used to work in one. We had a women's health clinic. We would talk about many of these reproductive issues with our female veterans. I think that there is a reasonable, Joshua, this is a time when no idea should be taken off the table. In fact, ideas should be put on the table. I'm even trying to understand if there's a way we can think about licensing of providers. There's minimum criteria for training people such as myself. And if we can make and ensure that every health professional is trained in how to provide reproductive health, then that will certainly help increase the number of health professionals that can offer these services, even for people seeking safe havens. So when I worked in the White House, there was no idea that wasn't worth putting on the wall and tearing apart. And I think that's what we need to do here. And it can be legal, it can be using existing regulatory, and then also dealing with some of the statutes. We've had some of these amendments in the books. There have been interpretation to those amendments. There is certainly room to think about those interpretations again.
I should note, by the way, that Nevada's Governor Steve Sisolak tweeted this evening an executive order to push back at some of the other states' abortion bans. He said that, among other things, Nevada agencies will not tell other states about people who come into Nevada, and it will also decline requests from other states to issue warrants for arrests of people who are charged with a violation under another state's abortion laws. Dr. Kavita Patel, appreciate you talking this through with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll get to some of today's other top stories in just a moment, including an update on yesterday's deadly Amtrak derailment in Missouri, today's sentencing for Jeffrey Epstein's confidant Ghislaine Maxwell, and President Biden's meetings in Europe at the NATO summit. Tonight's headlines begin in Missouri, where another person has died after that Amtrak train derailment. This brings the death toll to 4. Dozens more people are injured. In the last few hours, the chair of the NTSB said she is frustrated that the agency's warnings were not followed.
Anytime our recommendations aren't heeded, of course I'm upset, because we see tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and numerous fatalities and injuries. And we know, and it's very frustrating for our investigators, very frustrating when they are on scene and they know what would have prevented this.
Amtrak now says about 275 passengers and 12 crew members were on board. That is more people than originally thought. NBC's Maggie Vespa has the latest from the crash scene in Mendon, Missouri.
The death count in this wreck now standing at 4, with approximately 150 people taken to the hospital. The National Transportation Safety Board is on scene conducting the federal investigation into what caused it or what could have also prevented it. And that investigation is so vast, the wreckage is so widespread that they actually moved media away from that site to this local school to give a briefing earlier today. And at that briefing, they told reporters that they are alarmed by the lack of signals at that crossing, and that they've also been made aware that people in and around Mendon, Missouri have been complaining to local officials for years, calling that crossing dangerous. Now, they also add they're working to obtain what's called an events recorder from that train, which may very well contain video recorded on board the train of that crash. Amid all the chaos in this investigation and amid the tragedy, we're also hearing stories of heroism, including that of Boy Scouts from Wisconsin who, according to them and according to their troop leaders who are incredibly proud, rushed to save their fellow passengers once the train flipped over. We talked to 3 of those Boy Scouts, one of them telling us he actually helped comfort the driver of the dump truck that train crashed into as he lay on the street dying. Authorities confirmed that he died at the scene. They're also at this point not releasing the names of the 4 people killed, adding this investigation will take time. Maggie Vespa, NBC News, Mendon, Missouri.
Russia's assault on Ukrainian cities is not slowing down. Ukrainian officials reported more missile strikes and civilian casualties overnight. Yesterday, Russian missiles killed 18 people at this busy shopping center in central Ukraine. Today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke to the UN Security Council. He called Russia a terrorist state that's going on, in his words, a killing spree across Ukraine. President Zelensky also sat down with NBC chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. It was part of the Aspen Ideas Festival. The NBC Universal News Group is the festival's media partner.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky told us in a wide-ranging interview in collaboration with the Aspen Ideas Festival that President Putin is trying to drive a wedge between Ukraine and the West.
We are moving forward somewhere, and somewhere else we are retreating. But facing Russia one-on-one, I understand that it is going to be difficult for us, and probably we will not be able to hold out. Therefore, support is of paramount importance, support from Europe and, first of all, from the United States.
What does victory look like for you? And how does this war end?
The war will end for sure. I'm sure it will end with Ukraine winning, whatever happens. No matter how difficult it is for us, we must oust the occupiers from our land. For as long as we can, we will do that. That's our life. That's our path.
There are reports, rumors, they're not confirmed, that Vladimir Putin is sick. The Kremlin denies it, but there are these reports that he shakes, that he had cancer. Do you know anything? What do you believe? Is he sick?
To be frank, I don't know what is happening with Vladimir Putin, but I believe that over there they are very sick in general, sick with overinflated ambitions, unnecessary ambitions, with no understanding or respect towards international law, or simply no respect towards people's lives.
That was NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel. We'll share a link to the full conversation on Twitter and Facebook. You'll find us at NBC Now tonight. Ukraine will be perhaps the major topic of this week's NATO summit in Madrid. President Biden is there to take part in what could be a very consequential meeting, because among other things, it looks like Finland and Sweden could become NATO members after all. NBC White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell has more on that. Kelly, good evening.
Good evening, Joshua. Already a big diplomatic development here in Madrid, and it's about the size and nature of NATO. Sweden and Finland want to join the defensive organization, and now Turkey is no longer standing in the way. The three countries have worked out an agreement, and Turkey will no longer object to Sweden and Finland joining the organization. President Biden has been a part of those conversations. His team has been working for months to try to sort out the differences, and Turkey has been putting up some resistance, concerned about Sweden and Finland and their views on a terrorist organization involving the Kurds, and concerns Turkey has about that. Well, they've solved that for now, and so NATO could see its size grow. And it comes at a time when Vladimir Putin did not want that to happen, exactly the opposite of what he was hoping for. But it is in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that will be a huge topic here for President Biden and the other leaders of NATO. Tomorrow, the president will meet one-on-one with Turkey's president. He'll also be meeting with the head of NATO, the general secretary, and the work will begin again to try to focus on ways to strengthen the alliance, also ways to stop Russia with financial penalties and so forth. And we expect there to be new announcements about increased troop presence, not in Ukraine, but along those NATO border countries to show further strength to hedge against Russia. It has in some ways been a progressive diplomatic party here in Europe. First G7 in Germany, where 7 nations got together talking about a lot of these issues. Now coming to the NATO summit, where there is still more work to do. We'll be following all of it over the next few days. Back to you, Joshua.
Thank you, Kelly. That's NBC's Kelly O'Donnell reporting from the NATO summit. The former longtime partner of Jeffrey Epstein is facing 20 years in prison. Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced today. It's been almost 6 months since she was convicted of grooming teenage girls to be sexually abused by Epstein. Before the sentencing, Ms. Maxwell addressed the court for the first time. She apologized for the pain she had caused and acknowledged helping Jeffrey Epstein. She said, quote, "It is the greatest regret of my life that I ever met Jeffrey Epstein," unquote. Some of the trafficking victims were present in the courtroom for that, and that apology did not go over well with them.
I wish she was sorry when she was busy forcing me into a room to be raped. That's why I wish she was sorry. She should have been sorry then.
Ghislaine Maxwell was also sentenced to 5 more years of supervised release after prison, and she will have to pay a $750,000 fine. Up next, a devastating story out of Texas. 51 migrants were found dead inside an abandoned truck. We're live in San Antonio when we come back. It could be the deadliest case of human smuggling in many years. Yesterday, the bodies of dozens of migrants were discovered in an abandoned truck in San Antonio, Texas. The death toll is up to at least 51 people, 39 men, 12 women. The temperature in the area was above 100 degrees, so without air conditioning, the temperature inside that trailer was significantly hotter.
The patients that we saw were hot to the touch. They were suffering from heat stroke, heat exhaustion, no signs of water in the vehicle. It was a refrigerated tractor trailer, but there was no visible working AC unit on that rig.
Right now, local officials, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Mexican government are all investigating. Let's head live now to San Antonio, where NBC's Guad Venegas is standing by. Good evening, Guad. What's the latest we know tonight?
Joshua, the Mexican consulate in San Antonio just had a press conference where they shared more details of the survivors. So here's what we know as of now. 51 people, at least 51 are dead. We know that at the moment that they arrived and they rescued some of them, 13 were taken to hospitals. This is the latest information shared by the Mexican consulate. 13 were taken to 6 different hospitals. 3 of those are part of the 51 that are now reported dead. Now, we also spoke to a member of Catholic Charity Services who was at one of these hospitals yesterday and spoke and prayed, he said, with some of those survivors. Here's part of what he said to us.
We were praying with the second person at the hospital. It was a young lady. We finished praying and she opened her eyes. Nurse Bishop asked her, like, where are you from? Are you from Guatemala? And she said, yes, I'm from Guatemala. She didn't say yes, I'm sorry. She nodded her head. And we asked her if we could pray with her, and she said with her head, yes.
Now, one of the reasons why the latest update came from the Mexican consulate is because they believe that 27 of those inside the truck were Mexican. They used IDs and other documents that they had on them to identify them as Mexican, but that still needs to be confirmed. So that's what we know at the moment of those that survived. Like I said, they said 13 went to hospitals. Of those, 3 have died. The rest remain in critical condition. Some of the injuries that they told us they have seen is neurological damage, liver and kidney failure, and also internal bleeding of those that remained in the hospitals.
Well, the latest what we have from ICE is that the victims that have been identified, at least, are from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Tell us more about the federal response to this tragedy.
So any smuggling event, anything that has to do with smuggling at the border is usually investigated by Homeland Security Investigations. So DHS Secretary Mayorkas has responded with a tweet, a message to the families, sharing his feelings. There's always a message of sorrow, reminding people of the dangers that come with crossing into the U.S. We've seen an increased number of deaths, not just what we've been reporting here where people died inside the truck. We've seen a number of people that have drowned at the river between Texas and Mexico. They say just since June 9th, about 10 people have been reported to have died drowned at the river. So they want people to be reminded of the dangers. Now, Homeland Security Investigations, as part of DHS, will lead this investigation. They will work with multiple local and state agencies, as they usually do, to continue. Today, there was a report that after running the license plates from the vehicle, agents were able to detain 2 men, foreign nationals, who have been charged with illegal possession of a weapon. That's what we know as of now, as this investigation will continue, led by Homeland Security Investigations.
And briefly, Guad, tell us a little bit more about the back and forth between the state of Texas and the Biden administration. I understand Governor Greg Abbott is blaming the administration for this.
Joshua, this is, we could say, a long fight between Abbott and Biden. Abbott right away went to Twitter to blame the president for what's happened here. Now, we know in the past that Greg Abbott has criticized the Biden administration for their response to the increase in migrants coming to the border. Greg Abbott has also used state troopers to enforce immigration laws in the state of Texas. Remember that immigration laws have to be informed by federal agents. So he has criticized the current administration, saying they haven't been doing their job. We know that tomorrow, Greg Abbott will be at the border near San Antonio to offer a press conference and talk about the situation. We also know that large numbers of migrants have left in a new caravan, and some of the increase that we've seen at the border now could be a result of these new members of that caravan arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border, Joshua.
Thank you, Guad. That's NBC's Guad Venegas reporting tonight on a rainy night in San Antonio. It's perfectly natural and still rather taboo. But should it be? Some groups are trying to lift the stigma around periods. We'll show you how in tonight's feature report before we go. That time of the month. As a boy, I can remember how icky it felt once I realized what that term meant. The stigma around menstruation can set in early. Understanding and appreciation often come late, if at all. But today, more people are fighting the taboos around periods with education. Fair warning, our feature report speaks frankly but clinically about periods. Some of it may be uncomfortable. And maybe that's okay. Here's NBC's Maura Barrett.
Does this make you uncomfortable? How about this? What about now? How about now? Now, if you answered yes at any point, ask yourself, why? Periods are a normal bodily function. Yet 58% of American women admit to feeling embarrassed from being on their period, while 42% say they have experienced some sort of period shaming. But where does that shame stem from? A lot of menstruators say it's a societal problem. A study for Intimina, a period brand, found that over 50% of women were told or heard that periods make them emotionally unstable. Some were also told their periods were disgusting, unclean, and private. And the stigma around periods exists around the world. Some menstruators in Nepal aren't allowed to touch food, and in Bolivia, some believe period blood can cause illnesses. Between the stigma and access to proper period products, some children miss school when menstruating. One survey shows that 40% of girls in India do not go to school on their periods. It's a similar statistic for girls in Ethiopia. Your period can last anywhere from 3 to 8 days. For most people, it's around 5, with heavy bleeding on the first 2 days. And while the menstrual cycle is different for every person, it typically occurs every month, for about 40 years. If you do the math, that's about over 57,000 hours in a lifetime. Or 6.5 years. Over the years, the stigma even impacted how menstrual products were advertised in the U.S. Discreet packaging aimed at saving embarrassment, or the tiny tampon meant for virgins who hadn't had sex yet. And until 1972, menstrual products were banned from being advertised on TV or radio. Courtney Cox became the first person to say the word period on TV in 1985.
Tampax. It can actually change the way you feel about your period.
In recent years, advertising for menstrual products has made great strides, with more open dialogue and imagery. Many brands have opted out of using blue liquid to test their products, now using red, similar to the color of blood.
Your period is one small part of an overall menstrual cycle that is happening 24/7. So I think for us, we really see a responsibility to answer the questions that our audience has.
24-year-old Nadia Okamoto is the founder of August, a lifestyle period brand on a mission to create sustainable products and, quote, democratize access to quality care.
I think a lot of the period stigma makes us feel so alone in having a period. Like, you can't talk about it with anybody else. And we even have team members who didn't even tell their moms when they got their first period. I grew up in a family where I could talk about it openly, and I could show my mom my period blood in my underwear and ask questions. But when I went to school, I was made fun of for ever bringing it up, and we didn't learn about it in school, and the teacher was always whispering about periods. It was always like an immediate, okay, why is this such a weird thing to talk about publicly?
Menstruation education plays a large role in their mission and marketing.
You are listening to the first ever episode of The Period Feels. A lot of the educational initiatives we do now, from having a podcast called The Period Feels, all the way to having a searchable database of period health questions, a long-form blog on our website called Ask August. The idea and creation of those educational resources came from being requests from our community, because we kept showing up saying, let's talk about period products, and they were kind of turning back to us saying, well, we haven't even really figured out what periods are in the first place. Okay, we're gonna have a little tampon demonstration. I put it in at like an angle, like reaching towards my lower back at like a 45-degree angle.
Normalizing periods is at the core of their social media presence.
The rule from the very beginning of August is that we will always be as accurate as possible about demonstrating how our period care works. And that means, as much as possible, using real period blood, but also only using red liquid. That, to me, is like the bare minimum of what we can do as a brand to be as transparent as possible about the accuracy of a product.
August launched in June 2021. Since then, they've garnered hundreds of thousands of followers on TikTok and Instagram. Nadia's personal account, where she also promotes the products, has gained over 3 million followers. Despite the large following, the content is still met with mixed reactions.
A lot of the comments to our educational videos showing period blood ranges from, ew, you're disgusting, you need to die, go kill yourself, to all the way to, oh my God, I wish I had this when I was younger. Comments that I find super, super meaningful and that I think about a lot are the ones that are like, when I saw this, I thought it was disgusting, and then I remembered that every month I see the same thing in my underwear. It's just a really touching comment to me, because I think even for me, every day I do this work and I chip away at my own period shame.
August is not the only brand making efforts to normalize periods. In 2017, Bodyform became one of the first brands to use fake red period blood in its advertisements, captioning the video, "Periods are normal. Showing them should be too."
We're not telling everybody to, be obsessed with the magic of their period. We're just saying, let's have this be something that we appreciate as being normal, natural, a biological function that, by the way, makes human life possible, but also just be something you're not scared of or not ashamed of. But this is a natural part and powerful part of human life that we deserve to have cared for.
That was NBC's Maura Barrett alongside producers Vruti Venkatesan and Cynthia Silva with that feature report. Now, perhaps that piece brought some stories or questions to mind for you. Send them my way or sound off on any of tonight's stories. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can always leave us a brief but brilliant voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Remember, we are watching primary election results in a number of states. The polls are about to close in New York and Colorado. We're watching races in Illinois and Oklahoma. Stay with NBC News Now and NBCnews.com for more on that. But until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for making time for us, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.